The silence arrived first. On the 18th of November in the year 1645, the perpetual whisper of the wind through the vast Siberian taiga ceased. The air grew heavy, still, and crystalline. For Dmitri, a man whose 50 winters were etched into the deep lines of his face, this was the first and most ominous sign. He stood outside his izba, a sturdy log cabin on the outskirts of the fledgling settlement of Yakutsk, and watched his breath hang in the air, not as a fleeting cloud, but as a solid, unmoving plume of ice crystals. The sun, a pale, indifferent disk in the southern sky, offered no warmth, only a cold, metallic light that glinted off the frozen surface of the Lena River. The great frost, the Veliki Moroz, was coming. Yakutsk, founded as a simple ostrog or fortress only 13 years prior in 1632, was a lonely outpost of the Tsar's expanding empire, a tiny island of Russian life in a vast sea of indigenous tribes and unforgiving wilderness. Dmitri had been one of its first settlers, a trapper drawn by the promise of sable, the soft gold that fueled Moscow's greed. He had come in 1634, leaving the relative comfort of Tobolsk, and had learned to survive not by conquering the land, but by submitting to its brutal, immutable laws. He had learned from the local Saka people, the Yakuts, whose ancestors had migrated to this frozen land in the 10th century, and he had combined their ancient wisdom with the stubborn resilience of his own Russian stock. Inside the izba, his wife, Anya, was preparing for the long, dark months ahead. The single room of the cabin was a world unto itself, a microcosm of life organized around the colossal form of the stove. The pech, a massive construction of clay and stone that occupied nearly a quarter of the living space, was the heart of their home, the source of all warmth and life. It was a pech po Chernomu, a black-fired stove, a design that had been used in the northern lands since the 9th century, a relic of a time before the luxury of chimneys. There was no flue to the outside. When it was fired, the smoke would pour directly into the room, filling the space with a thick, acrid haze, before slowly finding its way out through a small, high window and the cracks in the roof. On the 20th of November, a new arrival to the settlement, a young Cossack officer named Stepan, fresh from Moscow and full of the arrogance of the capital, paid a visit to Dmitri's home. He was part of a detachment sent in 1644 to reinforce the garrison, and brought with him the latest news and attitudes from the West. He wrinkled his nose in disgust as he stepped through the low doorway, his eyes watering from the lingering scent of old smoke. "You live like primitives," he said, his voice a mixture of pity and contempt. "In Moscow, even the merchants now have white stoves with proper brick chimneys. The smoke goes outside, old man. It is the 17th century, after all." He boasted of the new stove he was having built in his quarters, a smaller, more efficient design with a tall, elegant chimney. "Clean air and good heat," he proclaimed. "That is the modern way." Dmitri simply nodded, his face impassive. He had heard such talk before. He had seen men arrive with new ideas, new tools, new certainties. He had also seen the taiga break them. On the 25th of November, he took his son, Alexei, a boy of 10, out to check their trap lines. The cold was now a physical force, a pressure that seemed to squeeze the very air from their lungs. The larch trees, normally supple, were as brittle as glass, their branches groaning and cracking in the stillness with sounds like pistol shots. This was the Trescan, the frost crack, another sign that the temperature was plummeting towards a dangerous new low. They found a fox in one of the traps, frozen solid in mid-stride, its fur already stiff with ice. Dmitri knew that at such temperatures, even the animals, the true masters of this land, were beginning to fail. He showed Alexei how to read the signs. The way the squirrels had built their nests unusually low to the ground, a behavior he'd noted on the 1st of October. The early migration of the reindeer herds, which had passed by their settlement on the 15th of September, a full month ahead of schedule. The unusual thickness of the ice on the river, which had frozen over completely by the 10th of October. The land was speaking, warning them, but only the old ones, and those who had learned to listen, understood the language. By the 1st of December, the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees. The world outside the Izba had become an alien landscape. The sun was a distant memory, its light a pale, horizontal smear for only a few hours each day. Life contracted, shrinking to the confines of the small, smoky cabin. The days were measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of the stove. Each morning, before the first hint of dawn, Dmitri would perform the ritual of firing the petch. He would load it with dry birch logs, which he had spent the short summer of 1645 cutting and stacking. He would light the fire, and for the next 3 hours the cabin would be filled with a dense, choking smoke. They would open the volokovoye, a small sliding window just below the ceiling, and the thickest of the smoke would pour out into the frozen air. The family would huddle on the floor below the level of the smoke, their eyes streaming, their throats raw. It was a daily ordeal, a necessary poison. Stepan, the Cossack, would mock them from his clean home. "I wake to fresh air and a warm room," he would shout across the frozen expanse between their cabins on the 5th of December. "You wake to a smokehouse," Dmitri would not reply. He knew the secret of the black stove, a secret that Stepan, in his modern arrogance, could not comprehend. The smoke was not just a byproduct, it was a part of the system. It cured the logs of the cabin, making them resistant to rot and insects. It killed the parasites and bacteria that thrived in the close confines of winter living. And most importantly, the massive clay and stone body of the stove, heated by the intense, direct flame, would absorb and store a tremendous amount of heat, a thermal mass that would radiate a gentle, steady warmth for the next 24 hours, long after the fire had died and the smoke had cleared. On the 10th of December, the true cold arrived. The mercury in the settlement's primitive thermometer, a device brought by a German engineer in 1642, froze. The old Saka shaman, who had lived for 80 winters, declared that he had never seen such a frost. He estimated the temperature at 60 degrees. At this temperature, metal became brittle and could shatter like pottery. A thrown cup of water would freeze before it hit the ground, turning to a shower of ice crystals. The world had entered a new state of being, a realm of absolute cold. That night, a frantic pounding came at Dmitri's door. It was Stepan, his face a mask of terror, his fine Moscow coat offering no protection against the lethal cold. "My stove. It is out," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "The fire, it will not stay lit. The chimney, it is frozen. We are dying." His modern, efficient stove, with its narrow flue, had been its undoing. The small amount of moisture in the smoke had frozen in the chimney, blocking it completely and extinguishing the fire. His clean house was now a death trap, its walls radiating a killing cold. Dmitri pulled the terrified man inside. The air in the Izba was warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke, sour milk, and human life. The great stove, its surface warm to the touch, radiated a gentle, life-giving heat. Alexei and Anya were asleep on the polati, the wide sleeping platform built atop the stove, bathed in its warmth. There was no fire, only the deep stored heat of the morning's burn. Dmitri looked at the Cossack, his eyes not with triumph, but with a weary pity. The taiga had claimed another student. The great frost was here, and the first lesson had been taught. Outside, the world was a silent, frozen hell. Inside the smoky cabin, life, stubborn and resilient, held on. The question was no longer whose method was better, but who would survive to see the spring of 1646. The long night had just begun. Part 2. Dmitri dragged Stepan and his half-frozen wife, Elena, and their young son into the single smoky room of his izba. The transition was like moving between worlds. Outside, the universe was a silent, crystalline void, actively hostile to life. Inside, it was a warm, breathing, living space. The air was thick with the smells of dried herbs, curing leather, and the faint lingering tang of wood smoke, but it was a heat that penetrated to the bone. Stepan's wife collapsed onto a bench, her body racked with violent shivers, while their son, his face pale and his lips blue, stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes at the massive, silent stove. Anya, Dmitri's wife, moved with a quiet efficiency that had been perfected over 30 winters in the north. On the 11th of December, she wrapped the boy in a heavy bearskin and sat him on the polati, the sleeping platform atop the stove, the warmest place in the house. She gave Elena a steaming cup of tea brewed from chaga, the mushroom that grew on the birch trees, a potent medicine against the cold. Stepan, meanwhile, paced the small space like a caged animal, his pride shattered, his modern certainty replaced by a raw, primal fear. "It was supposed to be better," he muttered, his voice cracking. "The engineer in Tobolsk in the summer of 1643, he showed me the plans. A smaller firebox for efficiency, a narrow flue to draw the smoke out fast. He said it was the future." Dmitri sat by the stove, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone. He let the Cossack's panic burn itself out before he spoke. "The future has to survive the present, Stepan," he said, his voice calm and even. "Your stove is for a different world. It is for Moscow, where the winter is a guest. Here, the winter is the master." He gestured for Stepan to sit. It was the 12th of December, and the lesson began. "You see our stove," Dmitri began, "and you see a primitive thing. You smell the smoke and you think of filth. You do not understand the system." He picked up a piece of birch firewood, its bark peeling like paper. "Your stove is a hungry beast. You must feed it constantly, and most of its heat escapes up your frozen chimney. It is a fool's bargain. My stove, the Pech po Chernomu, is a patient bear. I feed it once, a great meal, in the dark of the morning. For 3 hours it is a demon. It fills the house with its poison." He pointed to the ceiling, where the massive logs were blackened to a deep, glossy ebony, almost like they were lacquered. "This poison is our medicine. The smoke cures the wood. My izba was built in 1635. The logs are as sound today as they were then. Your clean house will rot from the damp in 10 years. The smoke kills the mold that grows in the walls. It kills the lice that would infest our clothes. It keeps the air dry. When the smallpox came through the Upper Lena settlements in 1639, the families with the black stoves fared better. The smoke is a harsh guardian, but it is a guardian nonetheless." He then explained the heart of the mystery, the thermal mass. "The fire is not the heat, Stepan. The fire is just the tool to create the heat. The real warmth is here." He slapped the clay side of the massive stove. "This is 4 tons of stone and clay. For 3 hours the fire rages inside, and the smoke heats the mass. The heat goes deep, deep into the belly of the beast. Then the fire dies, the smoke clears, and for the next day the stove breathes. It breathes a slow, steady warmth into the room. It does not scorch you. It does not abandon you. It is a constant, like a mother's love. Your stove gives you a quick, fleeting warmth. Mine gives a deep, abiding life." The great frost did not relent. By the 14th of December, the temperature, if it could be measured, had fallen even further. The very air seemed to have a weight, a crushing presence. Stepan's family could not stay in the crowded izba indefinitely. On the morning of the 15th of December, Dmitri made a decision. "We will fix your house," he announced. Stepan looked at him as if he were mad. "Fix it? It is a tomb of ice. We cannot build a new stove in this." "We will not build a new one," Dmitri said. "We will teach your old one how to be a proper Siberian." The first task was the most perilous, dismantling the frozen chimney. In the brief 2-hour window of gray twilight that passed for day, Dmitri and Stepan climbed onto the roof of the Cossack's cabin. The cold was a physical assault. Every exposed patch of skin burned as if touched by fire. Their tools were useless. The steel of their axe heads was as brittle as ice. Dmitri had come prepared. He had heated several large flat stones in his own petch and carried them up, wrapped in furs. He placed the hot stones around the base of the brick chimney, a slow, agonizing process of thawing the mortar. Then, using heavy bone chisels made from moose femurs, they began to chip away at the frozen structure, knocking the bricks loose one by one and casting them into the snow below. It was terrifying work. A single misstep on the icy roof would mean a quick, frozen death. A collapse of the chimney could take the whole roof with it. But by the time darkness fell completely on the 16th of December, the chimney was gone. They sealed the hole in the roof with a temporary plug made of packed moss, animal hides, and snow, which froze into a solid, if crude, patch. The next day, the 17th of December, they worked inside. They had to turn Stepan's white stove into a black one. Using the same technique of heated stones and bone tools, they painstakingly knocked a hole in the back of the stove's firebox, creating a new gaping mouth that opened directly into the room. They then sealed the original flue that led to the chimney. The transformation was complete. Stepan's elegant Moscow stove was now a crude, mouth-gaping monster. On the morning of the 18th of December, they attempted the first firing. Dmitri directed the process, loading the firebox with a large pile of birch. He lit the wood, and the cabin began to fill with a thick, rolling smoke. Elena cried out in fear, grabbing her son and pulling him to the floor. Stepan, too, was terrified, his eyes wide with panic as the acrid smoke filled his lungs. "Stay low," Dmitri commanded, his voice a low growl. "The smoke is lighter than the air. It will rise. Breathe where the air is clean." He opened the small Volokhovoy window he had cut high in the wall, and a thick black column of smoke began to pour out into the impossibly cold air. For 3 hours they endured the smoke-filled hell. It was a baptism by fire and soot. Then, as the last of the wood turned to glowing embers, Dmitri sealed the firebox and the smoke window. Slowly, miraculously, the smoke began to clear, and then they felt it. A new kind of warmth, not the sharp, direct heat of an open flame, but a deep, penetrating radiance that seemed to come from the very heart of the stove. The clay and stone, having absorbed the intense, smoky fire, was now releasing its stored energy. For the first time in a week, the walls of Stepan's cabin were not radiating a deathly chill. The ice on the inside of the windows began to melt. They had done it. They had survived. That night, the 19th of December, Stepan's family slept in their own home, warm and safe for the first time since the great frost had begun. Stepan, humbled and grateful, looked at the blackened walls and the monstrous, life-giving stove, and saw not a primitive hovel, but a miracle of engineering. But their ordeal was far from over. As the silence of the deep, frozen night settled over the settlement, a new sound reached them. It started as a low moan, Then rose to a series of sharp, hungry yelps. The wolves. The great frost had driven them from the deep taiga. They were starving, and they had smelled the smoke, the scent of life in a world of death. Dmitri, hearing the howls from his own cabin, grabbed his hunting spear. They had won the battle against the cold, but they had just announced their presence to an enemy that did not fear the frost, an enemy that was now circling their tiny island of warmth in the vast, frozen dark. Part 3. The warmth of the cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a beacon. The howls of the wolf pack, a sound Dmitri had known his whole life, were different now. On the night of the 20th of December, the sound was not the distant, lonely call of the taiga. It was a tight, hungry circle of sound that pressed in on the two small cabins. The smoke, which carried the scent of burning birch, cured meat, and living, breathing humans, had drawn them from the frozen depths of the forest where their usual prey had either fled or frozen. The great frost had upended the natural order, and now man was the most viable meal on the landscape. Dmitri stood by the small, hide-covered window of his izba, peering into the oppressive darkness. He could see nothing but the faint, ghostly light of the stars on the snow, but he could feel their presence. He counted at least 10 distinct howls, a large pack, and they were not passing through. They were waiting. The siege had begun. For the next 3 days, from the 21st to the 23rd of December, the two families were prisoners in their own homes. The cold remained absolute, a solid wall of 60 degrees that made venturing outside for more than a few moments an act of suicide. The wolves, creatures born of the cold, were untroubled. They patrolled the perimeter of the small clearing, their dark shapes flitting between the trees, their eyes glowing like malevolent green embers in the brief twilight. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant unnerving presence of the predators, combined with the confinement and the perpetual gloom of the polar night, began to fray their nerves. Elena, Stepan's wife, was near breaking point. The daily ritual of filling the cabin with smoke, which she had accepted as a necessity on the 18th of December, now felt like a form of torture. "We are choking in here while they wait for us out there," she sobbed on the evening of the 22nd. "What is the point? We have traded a quick death for a slow one." Her son, little Ivan, had started having nightmares, waking up screaming about the shadow dogs with glowing eyes. Their resources were dwindling. Dmitri had a good stock of firewood, enough to last another month if he was careful. He had salted fish and cured moose meat hanging from the rafters, but their water supply, which they got by melting blocks of river ice, was running low. The ice blocks were kept in the Seni, the unheated entryway, and going out to hack more from the frozen Lena was impossible. The wolves were often lying near the riverbank, a strategic choice. On the 23rd of December, Dmitri rationed the water, a grim sign that their situation was becoming dire. Stepan, stripped of his officer's bravado, was a man transformed. The fear was still there, but it was now tempered with a grim resolve. He looked to Dmitri not as a primitive elder, but as a commander in a war he did not understand. "What do we do?" he asked on the 24th of December, his voice low and steady. "We cannot wait for them to leave. They will outlast us." Dmitri knew he was right. The wolves were patient. They could survive for weeks on little food, their metabolism slowed by the cold. The humans, for all their fire and ingenuity, were fragile. "We cannot fight them on their terms," Dmitri said, his eyes fixed on the warm, glowing side of the petch. "The cold is their ally, the forest is their home. We must fight them on our terms. We must fight them from here." An idea born of desperation and a lifetime of observing the interplay of fire, smoke, and cold, began to form in his mind. It was a mad, dangerous plan, but it was better than the slow, inevitable death they were facing. He began to explain it to Stepan, his voice a low murmur against the sound of the wind, which had begun to rise again, carrying the howls of the wolves with it. "The wolf fears two things more than any other," Dmitri said. "Fire and the unknown. We will give them both." The plan was to create a weapon out of the very air they breathed. The intense cold that was their enemy could also be their tool. Dmitri's plan was to use the extreme temperature differential between the inside of the cabin and the outside world to create a sudden, violent, and terrifying event. Their preparations began on Christmas Day, the 25th of December, a holy day that felt like a mockery in their current predicament. While Anya and Elena prayed before the small icon in the red corner, Dmitri and Stepan worked. First, they spent the morning firing their respective stoves to their absolute maximum capacity. They packed the fireboxes with the driest birch, creating an inferno that heated the clay and stone mass until it was almost too hot to touch. The cabins became stiflingly hot, the air thick with a superheated smokiness. Next, they prepared their ammunition. They took the last of their water and poured it into several shallow wooden bowls, leaving them in the sini to freeze solid. But they did not just use water. Into each bowl, Anya added a mixture of rendered animal fat and a pungent combination of herbs, including wild garlic and bog myrtle, which she normally used to keep insects away in the summer. The idea was to create not just a projectile, but a stink bomb, an olfactory assault that would confuse and terrify the wolves. Finally, they prepared the delivery system. The Volokovoye, the small smoke window high on the wall, was too small. They needed a larger opening. Working together, they carefully removed the frozen hide that covered one of the larger, lower windows. They replaced it with a heavy wooden shutter that could be swung open from the inside. It was a huge risk. Opening such a large aperture, even for a moment, would let in a blast of lethal cold. By the evening of the 26th of December, everything was ready. The stoves were radiating a ferocious heat. The frozen bowls of fat and herbs were solid blocks of ice. The wolves, agitated by the increased activity and the tantalizing smells, were growing bolder, their howls more frequent, their dark forms creeping closer to the cabins. The moment had come. "Alexei, you stay on the polati and do not move, no matter what you hear," Dmitri commanded his son. He looked at Anya, a silent exchange of fear and trust passing between them. He and Stepan took their positions by the newly shuttered window in Dmitri's cabin. Stepan held a long wooden pole, ready to swing the shutter open. Dmitri held a large, wide-mouthed wooden bucket into which he had placed one of the frozen blocks of fat. "Now," Dmitri said, his voice barely a whisper. Stepan threw his weight against the pole. The shutter, frozen in place, resisted for a moment, then burst open with a loud crack. A wave of unimaginable cold, a physical blow, slammed into the room. The superheated air of the cabin met the 60-degree air of the outside world in a violent, instantaneous reaction. A thick, white fog of condensation exploded outwards from the window. In that same instant, Dmitri heaved the contents of the bucket, boiling water he had just taken from a pot on the stove, out into the night. The effect was beyond anything they could have imagined. The boiling water did not fall to the ground. It vaporized instantly upon hitting the frigid air, exploding into a massive, instantaneous cloud of ice crystals and steam. It was a localized, man-made blizzard, a whiteout that erupted directly into the faces of the nearest wolves. The sudden blinding cloud, combined with the shocking alien smell of the boiling fat and herbs, threw the pack into a state of utter panic. They heard yelps of pain and terror, not the howls of hunger, but the cries of shocked, terrified animals. The wolves, confronted with a phenomenon that was completely outside their experience, a sudden, hot, stinking storm that erupted from the wall of the silent cabin, broke and fled. They scattered in all directions, disappearing back into the darkness of the taiga. Dmitri and Stepan quickly slammed the shutter closed, their bodies already shaking from the brief exposure to the cold. The cabin was filled with a swirling mist, but it was a mist of victory. They had done it. They had used the cold itself as a weapon. They had fought the taiga on its own terms and won. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, more terrifying realization dawned on Dmitri. He looked at the empty bucket, then at his dwindling pile of firewood. The plan had worked, but it was a costly one. They had used a significant amount of their precious water and fuel to repel the attack. The wolves were gone, for now. But the great frost remained, and in the distance a single defiant howl echoed through the night. It was the pack leader. They had been surprised, but not defeated. They would be back, and next time they would be warier. Dmitri knew that they had only won a single battle. The war for survival was far from over, and their most audacious weapon had just been revealed to the enemy. Part 4. The single howl was a promise. For 2 days, the 27th and 28th of December, an unnerving silence settled over the clearing. The wolves were gone, but their presence lingered like a bad dream. Dmitri used the brief respite to replenish their ice stores, a frantic, nerve-wracking excursion to the frozen river, his spear in one hand and his axe in the other, his head constantly scanning the tree line. The cold was still absolute, a constant grinding pressure that made the simple act of breathing painful. On the night of the 29th of December, they returned, but they were different. They did not howl. They did not circle. They used the darkness and the terrain with a terrifying intelligence. The first sign of their return was a soft scratching sound at the base of Stepan's cabin wall, the sound of claws testing the log foundations. The wolves were looking for a weak point. The psychological warfare had begun again, but this time it was a silent, creeping dread. The families took turns on watch, peering through tiny peepholes into the darkness, their eyes straining to catch a glimpse of a moving shadow. On the 30th of December, Alexei, who was on watch in their izba, let out a sharp gasp. Dmitri rushed to his side. Pressed against the frozen animal hide window was the face of a wolf, its breath creating a small, fleeting circle of thaw on the translucent surface. Its eyes, cold and intelligent, stared directly at them for a long moment before it vanished back into the night. They were being studied. The pack leader, a massive, dark-furred beast they had glimpsed during the first attack, was learning. It understood that the danger came from the window. It understood that the humans were trapped. It was no longer a simple predator. It was a strategist. The crisis came to a head on New Year's Eve, the 31st of December, 1645. The firewood in Stepan's cabin was almost gone. His modified stove, lacking the true mass of Dmitri's purpose-built petch, required more frequent, smaller firings to maintain its heat. They had enough wood for 1, maybe 2 more days. After that, the cabin would become a tomb, and Dmitri's own fuel supply would not be enough for 2 families for the rest of the winter. "We have to make a run for the main stockade," Stepan said, his voice a ragged whisper. The Yakutsk Ostrog, built in 1643 to replace the original fort, was half a mile away, a fortress of thick wooden walls and armed men. In normal conditions, it was a short walk. In the great frost, with a pack of intelligent, starving wolves waiting, it was an impossible journey. "We would not make it 100 paces," Dmitri said flatly. "They would be on us before our lungs froze. They are waiting for us to come out." Despair, cold and heavy as the frost itself, settled over the two families. They were caught in a vice. On one side was the crushing, absolute cold. On the other, a patient, intelligent predator. It seemed that their fight was over. Anya began to quietly chant a prayer for the dead, her voice a thin, reedy sound in the warm, smoky air. It was then that Dmitri looked at the stove, not as a source of warmth, but as a weapon. His previous plan had been defensive. This one would have to be an attack. It was a plan of such terrifying risk that he hesitated to even speak it aloud. "We will bring the heart of the Izba outside," he said slowly, on the 1st of January, 1646. "We will make a wall of fire." The plan was to create a moving barrier of intense heat and smoke that would allow them to cross the open ground to the stockade. It would require them to sacrifice the one thing that was keeping them alive, their stored heat. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. For the next 2 days, the 2nd and 3rd of January, they made their preparations. They tore apart the wooden benches and shelves in their cabins, creating a small pile of kindling. Then they began the most arduous task, dismantling the palati, the sleeping platform above Dmitri's stove. The heavy, smoke-cured planks were a precious resource. They fashioned them into a crude, triangular sledge, a volokusha, designed to be pulled by 2 men. Upon this sledge they would build a portable hearth. They took the flat, heavy stones from the floor of the Seni and laid them on the sledge to create a fireproof base. The final, most critical component was the fuel. They couldn't use firewood. It would burn too quickly. They needed something that would burn with a slow, intense, smoky heat. The answer lay in the walls themselves. For generations, Siberians had used moss, dried peat, and animal dung mixed with clay as chinking between the logs of their izbas. This material, known as okol, was a superb insulator. It was also, when dried, highly flammable. Working frantically, they began to pry the frozen okol from the inner walls of Stepan's now doomed cabin. It was a desperate act of self-cannibalism, destroying a home to create a chance at survival. They piled the dark, fibrous chunks onto the sledge, creating a mobile fire pit. On the night of the 4th of January, they were ready. The wind had died down again, the silence of the great frost returning. The wolves, sensing a change, had grown restless, their dark forms moving agitatedly at the edge of the clearing. The 2 families gathered in Dmitri's izba. The women and children were wrapped in every available fur. Dmitri and Stepan stood by the door, the sledge behind them. Dmitri held a burning brand, a piece of wood pulled from the glowing heart of his pech. "When I open the door, do not stop," Dmitri commanded. "Do not look back. Follow the fire." He threw the door open. The blast of cold was breathtaking. He touched the brand to the pile of okol on the sledge. The dried material, rich with peat and dung, caught instantly. It did not burst into flame, but began to smolder with a ferocious intensity, releasing a huge, thick cloud of acrid, choking smoke and a wave of radiant heat. Dmitri and Stepan grabbed the ropes of the sledge and pulled it out into the snow. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The wolves, confronted not with a fleeing animal but with a moving wall of fire, smoke, and a terrifying alien smell, recoiled in confusion and fear. The smoke, dense and heavy in the cold air, clung to the ground, creating a rolling, opaque screen. The radiant heat from the smoldering pile was so intense it created a pocket of survivable air around the sledge. They moved out, a small, desperate procession shielded by a moving hearth. Anya, Elena, and the two boys huddled behind the sledge, their faces buried in their furs, while Dmitri and Stepan strained at the ropes, pulling their precious fire across the frozen snow. The wolves flanked them, darting in and out of the smoke, their howls a mixture of fury and confusion. One of the beasts, bolder than the rest, lunged out of the smoke, but was met with a blast of heat and a face full of choking fumes. It retreated, yelping in pain. The half-mile journey was an eternity. The sledge was heavy, the snow was deep, and the cold was a constant clawing enemy. Twice Stepan slipped and fell, and it was only Dmitri's iron grip that hauled him back to his feet. The fire on the sledge began to die down, the pile of okol shrinking with every yard they gained. The smoke thinned, the protective heat lessened. They could see the torchlight of the stockade, now a promise of safety just a few hundred yards away. But the wolves knew they were running out of time. The pack leader, the great dark wolf, launched a final desperate attack. It burst through the thinning smoke, ignoring the heat, its eyes fixed on Alexei, the smallest and most vulnerable of the group. There was no time to think. Dmitri let go of his rope, grabbed the hunting spear he had strapped to his back, and threw himself in front of his son. The wolf was on him in an instant, a blur of black fur and snapping teeth. They went down in a tangle of limbs, the man and the beast, a primal struggle in the snow. Dmitri felt a searing pain in his shoulder as the wolf's jaws closed, but he held on to the spear, driving it forward with all his remaining strength. Stepan, seeing Dmitri fall, let out a roar of fury. He grabbed a burning chunk of okol from the sledge with his gloved hands and hurled it at the other wolves, who were closing in. The sight of the flying embers and the renewed blast of smoke was enough to make them hesitate. It was that hesitation that saved them. A shout went up from the stockade walls. The gates swung open, and a group of armed Cossacks, alerted by the strange, moving fire, rushed out with torches and muskets. The crack of a musket shot echoed in the frozen air, and the wolves, their leader dead and their courage broken, finally scattered and vanished into the night. They were dragged inside the stockade, collapsing in the relative warmth of the gatehouse. They were alive. They had crossed the frozen hell and survived. Dmitri, his shoulder bleeding but his spirit unbroken, looked back at the smoldering sledge, a small, dying star in the vast, indifferent darkness. The great frost had not been defeated, but they had met its challenge with a fire of their own. They had brought the heart of the Izba out into the world, and it had saved them. The long war was over. Now all that remained was to survive until the dawn. Part 5. The Great Frost of 1645–46 became a legend in Yakutsk, a benchmark against which all other winters were measured. It was a winter that had tested the limits of human endurance and had forged a new understanding of survival in the extreme north. When the spring thaw finally arrived in late April of 1646, the settlers emerged from the stockade to a changed world. The taiga was littered with the frozen carcasses of animals, from the smallest ermine to the largest moose. The wolf pack that had terrorized them was never seen again, its power broken by the death of its leader. Dmitri, who recovered from his wound, became a figure of immense respect in the settlement. The Cossacks, who had once mocked his primitive ways, now sought his counsel on all matters of winter survival. Stepan, humbled and forever changed by the ordeal, became his most devoted student. The story of their desperate, fiery escape from the cabins became a local epic, a tale told and retold around the stoves of Yakutsk for generations to come. It was a story not just of survival, but of the triumph of ancient, hard-won wisdom over modern, untested theory. The most significant legacy of that winter, however, was the change in architecture. The events of the Great Frost provided a brutal, empirical demonstration of the superiority of the traditional black-fired stove system in the extreme Siberian climate. The failure of Stepan's clean chimney stove was a lesson written in ice and fear. In the years that followed, as Yakutsk grew from a small ostrog into a major administrative and commercial center, the construction of new homes followed the principles that Dmitri had embodied. The pech po Chernomu, the smoky stove, remained the standard for residential buildings in the region for another 2 centuries. It was not until the mid-19th century, with the arrival of new metallurgical technologies and a deeper understanding of thermodynamics, that the design began to evolve. In the 1820s, Russian engineers developed the Russian stove, a hybrid design that combined the massive thermal mass of the traditional pech with a complex labyrinthine system of smoke channels, or dimority, within the stove's body. This innovation, which first appeared in the wealthier homes of St. Petersburg and Moscow around 1815, allowed the stove to extract the maximum amount of heat from the smoke before venting it through a chimney. It was a white stove, but it was a white stove with a black stove's soul. It retained the principle of thermal mass, the slow, radiant heat, and the multifunctional design that had been perfected over 1,000 years of smoky living. This new design, which became widespread in Siberia by the 1850s, was a direct descendant of the ancient pech, a synthesis of old wisdom and new science. The legacy of the smoke itself also endured, albeit in a different form. The antiseptic properties of wood smoke, which Dmitri had understood intuitively, became a subject of scientific study in the late 19th century. Scientists like Robert Koch, in his work on bacteriology in the 1880s, began to understand the power of phenols and other compounds in smoke to kill microbes. The ancient practice of living in a smoke-filled room, while harsh, had provided a measurable public health benefit, reducing the transmission of airborne diseases and preserving the very structure of the home. The tradition of the banya, the Russian smoke sauna, which had its roots in the same chimneyless technology, continued to be a cornerstone of cultural and hygienic practice, a ritual of purification by smoke and steam. Today, in the 21st century, as the world confronts the challenges of energy scarcity and sustainable living, the principles of the Siberian izba are being rediscovered. The concept of thermal mass is a key element in modern passive house design. Masonry heaters, direct descendants of the Russian stove, are prized for their efficiency and the comfortable, radiant heat they provide. The ancient wisdom of using local, natural materials, of building small, well-insulated structures, and of storing energy is more relevant than ever. The story of Dmitri and the Great Frost is not just a historical anecdote, it is a case study in resilience, adaptation, and the profound, often counterintuitive wisdom of traditional technologies. In the Historical Museum in modern-day Yakutsk, one of the coldest cities on Earth, there is a reconstruction of a 17th-century izba. It is dark, small, and dominated by a massive clay stove. The logs of the ceiling are blackened with the soot of 1,000 fires. Visitors, accustomed to central heating and clean air, often recoil at the thought of living in such a primitive dwelling. They cannot imagine the daily ordeal of the smoke, the constant gloom, the crushing cold outside. But they also cannot feel the deep, abiding warmth of the stove, the security of the thick log walls, or the profound sense of safety that came from knowing you had the knowledge to survive the worst the world could throw at you. They see a relic of the past, but they are also looking at a blueprint for the future. Dmitri's izba, a smoky, humble cabin on the edge of the world, stands as a timeless testament to the ingenuity of the human spirit and the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the oldest ways are the wisest.